Hi, I'm Dr. Ryan Breshears, clinical health psychologist. In this video, we'll be talking about the psychological or cognitive, emotional, and behavioral aspects of stress. How we think and how we feel is impacted by self-talk. Self-talk refers to a variety of related communications that involve internal dialogue. We may or may not be aware of it as it's occurring. Regardless, self-talk is not inherently good or bad. It's simply internal verbal behavior that we've been doing for most of our lives. What we know is that self-talk can be positive, negative, or somewhere in between. And to the extent that this dialogue represents a pattern, it can have a significant effect on all of us. First, let's talk about positive self-talk. Positive self-talk is internal communication that can help us problem solve, remember things we need to do, regulate our impulses, monitor our progress towards goals, keep our emotions in check, and motivate us to succeed. These are thoughts that keep us focused, grounded, inspired. The science of positive self-talk is compelling. We know, for example, that when athletes use positive self-talk, their performance tends to improve. Basketball players who engage in more positive self-talk are more accurate from the free throw line, and soccer players who utilize it tend to improve their shots on goal. The same findings are true for non-athletes as well. What we find again and again is that positive self-talk is associated with better functioning at school, at work, and in our relationships with others. Now, just as there are different types of positive self-talk, we can also engage in negative self-talk, which comes in a variety of forms. A type of negative self-talk that is especially problematic includes the presence of cognitive distortions or thinking errors. Cognitive distortions contribute to biased ways of thinking about ourselves and our world. For example, we might exaggerate our flaws. We might resort to black and white thinking, or use judgmental labels to describe ourselves. All of these can be examples of cognitive distortions or thinking errors that can ultimately lead to unfavorable and preventable outcomes, such as depression or anxiety. While these emotions may be triggered by a perceived event or threat, they're often fueled long afterwards by a pattern of unhelpful negative self-talk. These thoughts can start changes in the brain, in turn producing changes in our body as mentioned in the biological stress video. Now, I want to make an important distinction. As I said before, negative self-talk is a result of cognitive distortions. Some thoughts might make us uncomfortable, but they don't contain cognitive distortions. You might have internal dialogue about something you did or said or an experience you had, and even though your thoughts could lead to sadness or anxiety, that doesn't mean that your thoughts are distorted. Negative self-talk is a pattern of flawed thinking that results in reality distortions. Let's take the cases of Joe and Vicky. Joe is a college student. He has a Chemistry 101 exam tomorrow worth 20% of his grade, and the instructor is known to be difficult. Joe hasn't tried to learn the material. In fact, he skipped half the classes this semester and he never cracked the book open. Right now, he carries a 73 average in the course. Now, say that Joe has the thought the night before the exam, I didn't work hard enough. I'm going to fail this exam. Joe might have negative feelings. He might even be disappointed in himself, but this is not negative self-talk. He's simply coming to grips with the decisions that he made and dealing with the logical consequences of not having prepared. Now let's take the case of Vicky. Vicky's also a college student, and she has a track record of academic success. She and Joe are in the same class, and she too has the exam tomorrow. But Vicky has showed up for every class all semester. She took advantage of a supplemental study session with the instructor, and she completed all the required reading last week. She's been reviewing her study notes, and she carries a 94 average, a solid A, heading into the exam. The night before the exam, she scores an 88%, a B+, on a practice test. After getting her score on the practice test, Vicky has the thought, I'm going to fail this exam. The instructor is going to think I'm incompetent and isn't going to give me a recommendation for graduate school. She immediately feels anxious. Now that sounds an awful lot like negative self-talk. We'll revisit this example in a few minutes. In a study of youth with type 1 diabetes, researchers found that the presence of cognitive distortions was associated with higher stress ratings, which led to poorer medical adherence and poorer metabolic control. Other studies have reached similar conclusions. Negative self-talk, if left unchecked, can contribute to unhealthy behaviors. When we develop a pattern of negative self-talk, we become more prone to ruminating thoughts, constant worrying. These are cognitive symptoms. The presence of these thoughts can perpetuate a pattern of chronic stress. We might exhibit problematic health behaviors that compromise our sleep, our diet, and physical activity, so physical symptoms begin to develop. And we might behave differently in our relationships, seeking reassurance from others, shutting down, withdrawing. The point here is that we can't isolate the psychological effects of negative self-talk from a more complete bio-psychosocial understanding. All of these components are related. Long-term, these problematic symptoms can impact our self-concept, leading to low self-esteem, dissatisfaction, and unfulfillment in relationships, and the onset of psychiatric conditions such as anxiety disorders, major depression, substance use disorders, etc. Further, unchecked cognitive distortions are associated with increased problems in daily functioning, meaning that our overall quality of life can suffer. Therefore, learning to manage our thoughts, especially negative self-talk, is an essential part of learning to care for our health. Here's the good news. We can change how we think. How do we do that? To change our negative self-talk, it can help to first know exactly what we're looking for. I mentioned a few cognitive distortions earlier, but I'm going to walk you through 5 of the more common ones. As you learn these, you can start to recognize them in yourself, and that's a critical step in addressing them before they cause bigger problems in your life. First, there's all or nothing thinking. This is a distortion of seeing things in either or terms, as if there are only 2 options. There's black and there's white. When we do this, we ignore the gray. We aren't able to see other possibilities. Number 2, magnifying or minimizing. When we magnify, we tend to embellish the negative aspects of ourselves or someone else by focusing on a weakness. When we minimize, we downplay the positive characteristics of ourselves or others. In both cases, we're neglecting to take the entire person into account. 3, labeling. When we label, we're making a fixed judgment about ourselves or someone else without considering that the evidence might actually be less disastrous. We're basically reducing ourselves or someone else to a single judgment. Truth is, people are more complex than we sometimes make them out to be. Number 4, catastrophizing. This is also called fortune telling. When we catastrophize, we're predicting that there will be a negative outcome without considering other, more likely outcomes. And number 5, mind reading. This is when we believe we know what others are thinking, failing to consider other, more likely possibilities. Now, there are many others, but these are some of the more common examples of negative self-talk. Now, remember the case of Vicky, the college student with a track record of academic success and a solid A average entering her chemistry final exam. Remember, she scored an 88%, a B+ on a practice test the night before the actual exam. And remember that after Vicky received her practice exam, she told herself, I'm going to fail this exam. The instructor is going to think I'm incompetent and isn't going to give me a recommendation for graduate school. Let's take a look at the cognitive distortions we just reviewed, and let's see how many Vicky is exhibiting. At the very least, Vicky's statement involves 3 cognitive distortions. First, she's engaging in all or nothing thinking. Even though she made an 88% on the practice test, she concludes that she's going to fail the exam. Secondly, she runs with this thought and engages in mind reading, presuming to know what the instructor is going to think about her. And thirdly, she catastrophizes. Not only has she concluded that she'll fail the exam, she also concludes that the chain of responses will result in her not getting a recommendation for graduate school. As you can see, this cascade of thinking errors happens quickly, and none of us are immune to them if we let our thoughts run unchecked. It's sometimes easier to identify a cognitive distortion when we're listening to someone else, but we might not always be consciously aware of our own. It's important that we improve our ability to identify our own thinking errors so we can change them. Here's how. Before we ever experience emotions like happiness, sadness, anger, we have to perceive or notice something. We'll call that a stimulus. And secondly, we have to interpret or appraise the stimulus. If we judge the stimulus in a positive way, we experience positive emotions like joy or awe. And if we judge the stimulus to be negative, we experience emotions like sadness, anxiety, or anger. It's in these negative appraisals that our cognitive distortions are often found. Now that sounds simple enough. Let's break it down a little further using Vicky to illustrate the point. Remember the timeline. Vicky had been preparing for the exam. She took a practice test. After receiving the score back from this practice test, she spiraled into several cognitive distortions and experienced anxiety. Something important is missing from the story, and that occurred between the time that Vicky got her score back, point A, and the first of her cognitive distortions, point C. Think of receiving the score as the stimulus, the stressor. For Vicky to have resorted to these thinking errors, her academic performance must be very important to her, and her appraisal of the score she received on the practice exam must not have been consistent with her goals. If Vicky didn't care about her performance in the class, she wouldn't need to feel bothered by a B+ score. We're more likely to feel something when it matters to us. Also, for Vicky to have been upset by a B+, she must have higher goals. She wants an A. And remember, she also wants a recommendation to graduate school. When we're trying to change our cognitive distortions, we have to work with point B on the timeline. And we do that by asking and answering a series of questions. Number 1, what does my reaction tell me about my needs? If I'm Vicky, what I need is to achieve. Number 2, which of my goals do I fear will not be met? Vicky might say, I'm anxious that I won't get into graduate school. 3, what is the evidence that supports this idea? And 4, what is the evidence against this conclusion? When we begin to challenge our irrational thoughts, we position ourselves to think in new ways and live in a healthier psychological space. So here's my challenge to you. Be the gatekeeper of your thoughts. Pay attention to them. And when you see thinking errors, work to correct them one at a time. Sometimes it can help to actually write your thoughts down on paper and then ask and answer the 4 questions. What is my reaction telling me about my needs? Which of my goals do I fear will not be met? What is the evidence that supports this idea? And what is the evidence against this conclusion? Also, if you're having difficulty identifying any flaws in your thinking, pay attention to the other information. Our bodies, our brains, and our behaviors. These give important clues as to what's bothering us. If you have physical symptoms, racing heart, headaches, pay attention to those. If you have feelings of sadness, anger, or fear, pay attention to those. And if you notice you're doing more of something that could cause problems for you, like drinking alcohol, or doing less of something helpful, like exercising or spending time with loved ones, pay attention to those behaviors as well. Our symptoms offer us clues that something about our thinking might need to change. Lastly, if you haven't already seen the other videos in this series, I encourage you to check them out. They address other biological, psychological, and social aspects of stress management. Thank you, and stay well.